Alright, going to talk about California in the Cold War. Last video was much too long, and I'm going to make it up to you. I swear. I promise. I'm crossing my fingers. That means I'm not actually promising. Like Ike. Or Nixon. I am not a crook. Anyway, origins of the Cold War. After World War II, there's only two groups standing. There's the freedom-loving United States, the Eagle. There's the Bear, the Soviet Union. And they are socialists. They're actually communists, but on the spectrum of left wing, they're over on the communists. We are arguably the most powerful nation, but they have an extraordinarily strong military. They, in our opinion, are expansionist because they roll into Eastern Europe. They do not allow those governments free elections. Places like Bulgaria, Romania, Poland, Czechoslovakia. They all are forced into communism, so it looks very expansionist. Some of the rhetoric that communists use, worldwide revolution, down with, the proletariat, they seem very anti-capitalist, very anti-democrat. But the degree to which they needed to be fought globally is still up for debate. And what we get out of this is an American idea that the Soviet Union needs to be contained. They need to be bottled up. We can't allow them to expand. It's a threat to our way of life. It's an existential threat. America will not exist in the form that it exists now if we allow the Soviets to expand. So we get what's called containment policy. So at home, Truman, who initiates this containment policy, starts to create a bunch of domestic programs. Atomic Energy Commission, National Security Council, the Central Intelligence Agency. And we're going to hyper inject our defense industries. Like I said before, this is how you get all this defense spending in California. We're going to make better atomic weapons, better fighter jets, better bombers. My grandfather worked for Lockheed. He was never done with projects. He worked on the SR-71, the U-2. He worked on the F-117 stealth fighter. He worked on the F-22. It never ends. It never ended. And they were always a decade ahead of where people thought they were, like, technologically. That's because of this fear that we had to be ahead. So the anti-communist agenda, this is really what the 1950s is really known for. The Cold War legacy of the US, unlike World War I, the country did not shift back to business as usual. Many of these changes were permanent, as I mentioned in the previous lecture. Permanent military-industrial complex, right? Politicians, weapons producers, and the military. The military would say what it needed, or the weapons producers would go to the military and go, we have this new stuff. The military would pressure the politicians, the industry would pressure the politicians, the politicians would vote for it, money would be extracted from the taxpayers, and the cycle would continue. And then the corporations that got enriched would use some of that money to bolster the campaigns of the politicians. So the politicians always had incentive to say yes to the military and the weapons producers. This creates a massive military-industrial complex. California benefits heavily from that. We get a whole bunch of other spending. I told you about the national highway system being enacted. Well, part of that is strategic. Well, what if the Soviets land on the West Coast? How do we move troops? We can't move divisions of armored vehicles down these old rusty or old rickety old Wild West roads. We needed we needed viable transportation. So national highway system is a strategic thing. It's not so you can go visit Yellowstone. It's really so we can move divisions around internally within the United States. So you get a lot of government aid to higher education. This is where DARPA is. DARPA is the something. Well, why can't I say DARPA is something? Look it up. You have Google. Why do you need a professor? Google is your professor. Half you guys use Wikipedia on your stuff anyway. Boo. Anyway, DARPA, Defense Appropriation. I don't know. Anyway, they developed the internet, right, as a way to transfer information amongst research institutes. The internet is a direct product of weapons research. It wasn't built by Al Gore or any of that stuff. So military bases, like I said, they become permanent, fabric of our nation. It's why when the Soviet Union fell, they closed McClellan and they started to transition Mather back into civilian. Like the whole Cold War justification lasted until I was an adult. It was crazy. Government culture. Government becomes more secretive during this time. We start locking our secrets down. Area 51 kind of stuff. It's paranoia about the Soviets. It affects our immigration policy. We start accepting immigrants from that are escaping communism. Becomes a legitimate reason to enter the country. Except if you're Mexican. We had Operation Wetback in 1954. Not my name, government's name. It's the U.S. Military aided authorities in entering Mexican-American neighborhoods, rounding up Mexicans who could not prove their citizenship. Over 1 million Mexicans were deported. Because also, brown people were often lumped in with the anti-communist crusade, because any critique of America benefits the Soviets, right? So if you're an activist and you say, hey, I don't like the way America treats us, the way many of the white conservative anti-communist politicians heard it was, oh, you don't like America? That's the part they hear. And so anti-communism and immigration were definitely linked during this time. It was hard to separate it. But the Cold War continued to expose the U.S. hypocrisy in segregation. Many conservatives linked the civil rights movement to advances in communism, because again, if you oppose segregation and you're criticizing the United States, you're the only one who benefits, in theory, the only one who benefits from that is the Soviet Union. Obviously, you and I know that we benefit that because we're a more just society, and it's better to put those issues to rest and fix them and become the society that we pretend to be, than to just sweep it under the rug and say anyone that critiques it is a Soviet agent. But that was used to, suppress civil rights movement. So, immigrants took the brunt, civil rights groups took the brunt. Patriotism, it creates kind of this new definition of patriotism, is unwavering support of the government and the flag and the national anthem. Hyper patriotism, right? Any critique becomes sort of, well, you hate America. This is part of the anti-communist culture that gets set up. So you get, basically, it seeps into every facet of American life. By dividing the world into free and unfree, it automatically made anyone not hostile to communism an enemy of freedom. So if you're a socialist, or if you're like, well, hey, the Soviets do some things right. Like the Soviets, they had women in their military, they had female astronauts, they did lots of things that were ahead of our time. Like they did things that many of our progressives said, well, we should look at those ideas. We should, we should consider that. And all that stuff at this time was just, well, you're playing with fire if you did that. So you get loyalty review boards. This happens in California. They try to make professors take loyalty oaths. We get the House Un-American Activities Commission, which this will be important to you for your primary source for this week. It's established by Congress in 1938. It's called HUAC. HUAC aimed to identify subversive elements within the government and the general U.S. population. In 1947, HUAC begins hearings that focus on Hollywood. Hollywood, because it's full of artists and people that question the status quo and people that kind of come out of those circles, many of them hold very liberal views. And all of that is seized upon as a sympathy for communism. Now, there were communists in Hollywood. There were communists there, in any walk of life. But the degree to which they really existed and the degree to which they were a threat generally accepted historically as being exaggerated. But HUAC could drag citizens before it and demand answers, and they did with testimony. They some 300 some odd actors, writers, crew members from Hollywood were dragged before the HUAC commissions and grilled mercilessly, many of them on television. And so I'm going to have you look at some clips of HUAC discussions. I mean, they're kind of boring. I mean, because it's just people like talking about unions, because unions were sort of in the mind of the anti-communists, the infiltration point into, because unions have historically allied themselves with the left, going all the way back to the 1920s when we talked about the IWW and stuff like that. But the 50s, that connection between communism and unions is played around with a little bit. So some unions are viewed skeptically, and there's this clip of Walt Disney kind of talking about it. And I love that because here's a man who really is just a guy who owns a theme park and makes cartoons for kids, but he's giving these serious answers to these politicians about communists in his organization. And it's bizarre. It's surreal. It would be like having, you know, a commission in Congress right now who brought like, you know, YouTube stars and grilled them about stuff, or like memers, or you know, it's absurd. But you know, here's Walt Disney giving serious answers because he doesn't want, you know, to be affected by this. You know, he doesn't want to be labeled a communist. That's career suicide. So it's interesting. It's weird. That's the thing. It's not that these not that the videos are cool or fun, or they're just interesting, right? They're interesting what we're putting people through. So try to be interested. The Hollywood 10 people refuse to cooperate on First Amendment grounds. You're the government. I don't have to go say anything that incriminates myself. And they were jailed for 6 months and up to a year for contempt of Congress. Hollywood studios blacklisted hundreds of people that were accused of being communists. That's how Hollywood tried to defend itself. Don't regulate our industry. Don't put government officials on our lots. Don't, you know, stay away from us if we willingly persecute communists for the government, right? This connection, right, between culture. If you exert enough cultural pressure, people will self-persecute. The Soviet Union actually did that quite a bit, where the reason Soviet trains would be quiet was because no one would talk or ask each other questions, because the only people who asked questions in the Soviet Union were agents trying to get information from you. So one of the weird things about the Soviet society is it was unfriendly because the only people that wanted to befriend you were probably from the government. So culture can suppress a society even though no one's even standing there. A whole train car could be silent because they fear a government agent being there. Well, you could do it in reverse even in free countries, right? So we get a bunch of spy trials during this time. Alger Hiss, he's accused of passing government documents to another individual. He's convicted in 1950 and sentenced to 4 years. Richard Nixon really makes himself a national name with the Alger Hiss trial. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg are communist Jews who live in New York. They are communists, but what did they really do? In 1951, they're convicted of passing atomic bomb secrets to the Soviets. During World War II, Ethel's brother worked as a Los Alamos nuclear research center. They say it was a conspiracy case, not a spy conviction, really. In 1953, they were executed as spies. So, you know, this stuff's captivating. This stuff is captivating the country. This is front page news, and guys like Richard Nixon are coming up through the California system using anti-communism and their credentials of busting communists and outing communists as a way to climb the ladder, right? So Joseph McCarthy rises during this time. We get the term McCarthyism. He is a senator. We get the Army McCarthy hearings in 1954. It's a televised hearing where McCarthy starts accusing Army officials of harboring communists, right? It's borderline absurd, but, you know, McCarthy is a Republican senator in a Republican-controlled Congress, and this aggression over time starts to fatigue the American public. So McCarthyism, the term, is associated with destructive campaigns to discredit people through the use of unsubstantiated accusations, guilt by association, and character assassination. And, you know, Nixon used this, McCarthy used this. This becomes a tactic to sort of discredit your liberal opponent in elections. All you have to do is insinuate that they're a communist without any evidence, and that's enough to make the electorate go, well, I'm not, you know, I ain't voting for no commie, right? So just the accusation alone we're a little bit better at it now on issues because we're a little better at critical thinking, but back then it had a lot of sway. So, let's see. Might as well show you my pictures since I took time to pick them. Red Scare. That's McCarthy on the left. Got to stop communism. It's everybody's job. So, right, if you're the guy who cleans the studios and you hear an actress talk about communism, you're supposed to call the government. It's kind of what that infers, right? It's almost like when they had that thing, see something, say something. I kind of was cringy, like, I know, that's fine, but then you really want every, this was the terrorism after 9/11, the only way to prevent it is if you see shady things, you got to tell the government, right? I get it, but, really, we're going to start calling about, I don't know, it's a weird line. So anti-communism in our culture. From 1940 to 1960s, the anti-communist crusade shaped our culture. Republicans used the hysteria to damage the legacy of the New Deal, right? Because the Soviets do that kind of stuff. The Soviets are the ones that take national government and impose it upon the whole nation, and right, we're a federalist system where we have states' rights, and so a lot of that kind of stuff, especially since the Soviets essentially won World War II and came out strong, it doesn't look nearly as it's not as nearly as palatable as it was during the Great Depression. In the Great Depression, the Soviets were out of the picture. Really, they had basically a failed system, and we were desperate, so we were willing to do New Deal type programs. But post-war, no way. So, can't have anything that smells like socialism. State and local governments also created their own kind of committees. States required loyalty oaths. They banned communists from jobs. Agencies also refused professional licenses to communists. So if you were a doctor and you just were a member of the local Communist Party, they would strip your license. Like, how is that fair? How is that communist, right? Or how is that constitutional? You're supposed to have freedom of conscience in our country, right? Like, what you believe on your own time, it's largely up to you. And this is government kind of, trying to read people's minds. It's a little dicey territory. Agencies like the police departments also formed red squads. So they would go harass all the local left-wing activists, and go harass anyone associated with communism. California university system got sucked into it. In 1949, the Board of Regents imposed loyalty oaths on faculty and staff members in California universities. Professors lost their jobs. Many of them refused, kind of on principle, right? They want, I need freedom of conscience to be a good professor. This illustrates just how powerful the anti-communist culture had become. Courts would eventually rule most of these things as unconstitutional. Like, a person's belief systems, really, are they germane to their jobs? I mean, I guess maybe you can make an argument in some cases they might be, but for the most part, we don't really operate like that. It's really just a function of, can you do the job? California State Legislature created the California Legislative Fact-Finding Committee on Un-American Activities. It's just a mini state HUAC, right? Just a mini California HUAC. Federal government agencies used anti-communism to expand their powers and their departments. So the FBI gets an expansion. We get J. Edgar Hoover creates files on thousands of Americans accused of communism. They also target, the homosexual community, called the Lavender Scare. They can be the whole fear of homosexuals was that you could be blackmailed. Right, Soviet agents would find out you were gay and you worked in a defense contractor. You were an executive at Lockheed, and you'd be blackmailed to bring them plans. All this kind of stuff that's almost borderline crazy now. But if you were outed as gay in the 1950s, it'd probably ruin your life. You probably had a wife. You probably had some kids. Like, it could ruin your life. So it felt like agents could have enemy agents could have a lot of power. So the anti-communism didn't really spare anyone, right? Private groups, citizen groups pressured libraries to remove un-American books. My wife would love that. She's a librarian. She resists all attempts to tell her what to have in her library. Universities fired left-wing teachers and required loyalty oaths, which I said. Ethnic groups were often anti-communist if their home countries were occupied by the Soviets. Many Eastern European ancestors professed hatred. So Poles that had escaped, Ukrainians that had escaped, Czechoslovaks, they would come here and be very anti-communist. And we would often utilize that in foreign espionage. Businesses often use anti-communist hysteria to suppress their unions, right? Remember I said unions commonly associated with the left. And so they could bring in a lot of government support by just whispering like, man, I think the unions that want to control my business, I hear rumors that there's communists. They get a lot of support, infiltrate them, bust them. So, unions, the professionalized unions did pretty well in the 1950s because they struck a lot of deals with major employers. So I don't want you to get the wrong impression about unions. But there were some fringe unions that were definitely... could be targeted by the federal government. So, well, actually, yeah, this my notes right here. Organized labor engaged in internal battles. So a lot of organized labor also caught the anti-communist fever and purged many of their own hardcore left-wingers too, right? They were like, you're just a little too pro-Soviet. You're going to bring the heat of the federal government down on us. We don't need that, so you're going to exit the organization. So big cultural influence that worked its way all the way through the fabric of California. But by 1958, by 1960, everyone had fatigued out of this. It became pretty clear that the United States was the preeminent world power. We lost some of our insecurity. We had stalled the Soviets around, we had confronted them in Korea and stopped we had saved South Korea. In 1954 we were supporting France in Vietnam. We were starting to start a fight back, in various places in the globe. And by the 1950s, many Democrats had argued successfully that the Red Scare was largely hyper-conservative opportunism. They saw that with McCarthy, right? McCarthy did not come off looking very good. A lot of people saw Nixon as an opportunist. J. Edgar Hoover was not well liked. So as much ground as the Republicans gained from their anti-communist stance, they also overplayed their hand, and many Americans fatigued on this whole thing. And while it was never going to be popular to be a communist, we were still anti-communist well into the 1980s. There just wasn't that sense that you had to purge every institution and purge every, organization, and that time had sort of petered out, and Democrats were kind of able to come back to the conversation and put forth liberal views again. Generally, mostly not liberal economic policies, but definitely when it came to civil rights and things like that, it became increasingly hard to argue for, segregation of schools, things like that. It didn't seem free. If the Republicans were going to claim the mantle of freedom, Democrats could easily turn things like segregation around on them, and once they were allowed back at the table, you start to see that shift, and that gets us to the 1960s, which is a whole different beast. It's a whole different, the activism, everything sort of explodes in the 60s. But it's really not about who's communist and who's not anymore. It's based on interpretations of freedom. Can the federal government tell people to allow black people into their diners and stuff like that? It shifts a little bit. So anyway, I promised I'd make this one shorter. Hopefully it is shorter. I haven't looked at the time. But do your primary source. Cite your sources. It bums me when you don't cite them. I can't give you points if you don't cite them. I'm probably going to pick a couple of short clips. One will probably be the Walt Disney clip. I don't know who the author is. I don't know who's really filming it. It could be a news agency. It could be the government. I know, I don't know, you don't know. So if you put it in there like the origin of the film is unknown, that's still Walt Disney talking to the HUAC committee. You can't always know who the author is, so you don't have to sweat, bullets. Get it, It's mostly when you don't execute the terms of the instructions that I give you that I know are executable, like citing your sources, using your sources to bolster your arguments. Things like that I take points for, but if you can't do something, you don't have to run off to Wikipedia and find information that I know you don't have, because then I just know you've jumped out of your books and into some other thing to give me some obscure piece of information that I know, like, Walt Disney's brother Jeff enters the conversation, and I'm like, we never talked about Jeff Disney. I don't know who Jeff Disney is. I'm very tired, guys. It's late in the quarter. I get tired too, right? I know you want a break. I want a break. Anyway, so yeah, Red Scare, Cold War, all these cool terms. All right, goodbye.